Well, good evening. My name's Tim Davey. I'll be chairing this evening. It's going to be a special evening. It's actually the third in our series, which is really a very exciting series with the IET and the RTS, and getting back to the heart of something that I think is missing a bit, which is public lectures. You know, the two lecturers we've had before, they've always managed to just be ahead of the curve in terms of what they've been talking about. We've had Mike Lynch, who talked a lot about data in the modern world, data encryption, and since then we've had so much to chew on in terms of whether it be Apple, the NSA, everything else going on, that really got some thinking going. And then, of course, last time we had in this room, for those of us who are lucky to be here, we had a rather awe-inspiring performance by the young Demis Hassabis, who was unbelievable and talked about how his machine could possibly beat the Go world champion. And it was a nice drum roll to a rather fine performance by his machine a few weeks later. And these lectures really have always been designed and were conceived as a point in which we could get debating on some of those really big things that are shaping our society, and often where technology, science and the media intervene. And it's often, as someone who commissions a lot of programs, it's often where things meet and genres meet that you get really interesting territory, and I think we found that out in this series. Let me just do the thank yous very quickly before we start and introduce Sir Paul, which is thanks to the IET and the RTS for being the kind of drivers of these events, but also thanks to our sponsor, Fujitsu, who are here for the first time, and that's brilliant, and also to this wonderful venue that really inspires everyone when they come here, obviously the British Museum. Thank you very much for hosting us. Right, with no further ado, let me embarrass Sir Paul for a second, and it is brilliant to have him here. I have to say, if you introduce Sir Paul, most stories, if you read, start with the infamous rejection by Cambridge and a number of universities, which is, it's basically like missing the Beatles or not signing J.K. Rowling. It's one of the great admissions failures of our age. But Paul got through that, and obviously he went on to have I've only kind of picked highlights because it's so amazing what Paul has achieved over the years, starting with the Imperial Cancer Research Fund, which later became Cancer Research UK. He chaired the Department of Microbiology at the University of Oxford. He returned to Cancer Research UK in '93, went on to lead that and do so much groundbreaking work. President of Rockefeller University. 2010, of course, 5 years, President of the Royal Society, and now Chief Exec of initially the UK Centre of Medical Research and Innovation, but as we know it now, the Francis Crick Institute. We were chatting earlier, I mean, most people may get 1 honorary degree. Paul has 60 honorary degrees. That's just showing off, Paul, it really is, it's ridiculous. He feigned embarrassment when I told him, but actually the nice bit of this is that Cambridge also gave him an honorary degree, so having, you know, no doubt who got the last laugh there. He's got the Legion d'Honneur. I mean, the list just goes on and on. I think, you know, one thing that caught my eye was he's been recognised by the Chinese Academy of Science while holding an honorary membership of the American Academy of Arts and Science. So that's a pretty unique double. And of course, the Nobel Prize for the groundbreaking work he did on the discovery of protein molecules that control the division of cells, and all that work that's done so much to contribute and advance science in the UK. I have to say he's got one achievement that the other two lecturers have never had, which, as a BBC executive, is the crowning glory, which is he's done Desert Island Discs, which, by the way, people get very irrational about getting selected for, by the way. So that really is an amazing... And by the way, you can go and listen... Sorry, short commercial. You go and listen to Paul's Desert Island Disc tonight. I mean, he is obviously one of the great scientists living today. His works in genetics have been, in that field, but also beyond that, have been truly inspiring. But more than that, he's a real champion for science. And that's what you're going to hear about tonight. The format, of course, is Paul will give his lecture, then I'll sit down, do just 2 questions, then hand it over to the audience. So we need you guys to be thinking of questions. I have to say, what also comes through in Paul's career is obviously he is a risk taker. Drives motorbikes, flies planes, and Paul, we're going to enjoy the ride tonight. It's all yours. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Tim, for that introduction. I think this talk is going to be a bit behind the curve rather in front of the curve, so it will be a contrast. Demis Hassabis, I know, In fact, his wife was my graduate student, and when she was working with me, he came to talk about doing a PhD with me, but I thought his qualities were best somewhere else, and so that didn't happen, but he's great, and we're now actually discussing a collaboration. He now works for Google, and that's just next to the Francis Crick Institute, and we're beginning to talk about a possible collaboration. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for coming out this evening. Now, the title of my talk is deliberately bold, because I want to persuade you this evening that science is a highly revolutionary activity, and we don't normally think of it as such. When we think of revolutions, we of course usually consider major transformations in the spheres of politics, economics, social organization, religion perhaps, but not science. But to these activities, I want to add science, because the revolutions that have come about because of science, both cultural, through improved knowledge of the natural world and ourselves, and additionally, through the major impacts that improved knowledge can have on the development of human civilization, have been key. I think that science is the most long-lasting revolutionary activity known to humankind. And that is because science generates systematic knowledge that stands the test of time, and that's critical. And as a result, science has long-standing consequences for society. It acts as a driver, a major driver of culture and civilization, and of course, through technology, engineering, applications, brings about changes, dramatic changes in the ways that we live. So, why is science such a reliable way of generating systematic knowledge of the natural world and of ourselves? And that's easily stated, perhaps not so easily understood, but easily stated. It is because of the way that science is done. Science is based on a range of attributes and ways of working. These are not unique to science, that's important, but they are combined together in science in a very effective way. Science is based on reliable and reproducible observations and experiments, and these generate descriptions, usually accurate descriptions, of how the natural world behaves. And it is this evidence that forms the bedrock of science, because science is based upon evidence. From these observations, from these experiments, regularities and patterns can be recognized. And these in turn lead to ideas, to hypotheses, which explain the workings of the world. Imagination and intuition are important in generating these ideas and hypotheses, which are then tested by more observations and more experiments. This way of working has been emphasized by the philosopher of science Karl Popper, who worked for many years at the London School of Economics. He argued that a scientist considers the data obtained by experiments, by observations, which are relevant to a phenomenon of interest to that scientist, and then, through leaps of the imagination, develops a framework to consider that data and to generate hypotheses to explain that phenomenon. These hypotheses are then tested, and tested further by using it to make new predictions which can then be examined by more experiments and observations. It's a sort of trial and error type of process. If the data do not support the hypothesis, then it either has to be rejected or it has to be modified and tested again. Now, sometimes it can be difficult to judge when a hypothesis should be rejected, because not all experiments, not all observational data are unambiguous, and they can be difficult to interpret. But despite this difficulty, Popper's description reasonably reflects the way that many of our scientists actually work. And it has an important implication. And that implication is that in this view of science, scientific knowledge evolves. It is often rather tentative, especially at the beginning of an investigation, and it is only over repeated testing aimed at testing to destruction that hypothesis or idea becomes more secure. And that is, of course, the basis of the reliability of the knowledge that it generates. There's other aspects of science. Science is greatly influenced by the way that scientists themselves behave and interact with each other in a community. Good scientists, and not all scientists are good, but good scientists are open, they are honest, they're rigorous in their thinking, and they gather accurate information. They are skeptical. This is crucial. They are skeptical, especially of their own ideas. By the way, beware of people, scientists in the public arena who claim they're skeptics. They are usually completely unskeptical about anything they say themselves. Francis Bacon, courtier, statesman, philosopher of the 17th century, famously argued for a skeptical approach in the pursuit of knowledge. He said, and I love this sentence, if a man, because they were only men then, of course, apologies about that, but we have got a little better. If a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties. Very critical. Perhaps it would have been better if Bacon had confined himself to thinking about science, however, rather than doing science. Driving during winter in Highgate, just off Hampstead Heath, he stopped his carriage, bought a hen and stuffed it with snow to see if it would delay putrefaction of the bird. As a consequence of his outdoor experiment, he caught a chill, developed bronchitis and died several days later. An effective science community should also be interactive and collaborative. It should encourage the constant challenge of data, of ideas, of hypotheses. However, although scientists work in a community, they're also individualistic. They act as individuals, but behave in a community. Great advances are usually driven by creative and technically capable individuals. In my view, parallels can be drawn with those working in the creative media. Television, for example, which also requires both collaborative teamwork and creative, technically competent individuals. In both spheres of activity, good practitioners are often rather anarchic. Trying to organize or manage them is like herding cats. I'm sure it's the same in television, certainly the same in science, and quite often in engineering too. The combination of these attributes that I've outlined for you and these ways of working produces the methodology that underpins science, which is very effective at generating reliable knowledge of the natural world and ourselves. And it's this knowledge which leads to revolutionary changes, both for our culture and our beliefs, and also for the ways that we live. Now I want to, and that's why I said we're going to look at the back of the curve, I want to do a little bit of a run through some history of science to illustrate what I mean. Until the 16th century, the prevalent view was that the sun circled the Earth. Copernicus proposed an alternative heliocentric view, the Earth and planets circled the sun. And these were supported by Galileo's observational evidence obtained when he turned his simple telescope towards the planet Jupiter and discovered what he called the Medici moons, probably trying to get funding from his patron by calling them the Medici moons, circling the planet. Clearly, he concluded that celestial objects, not all of them, were orbiting the Earth. Some were orbiting other celestial objects. And that lent strong observational support to the heliocentric views of Copernicus. Thus began a process whereby our terrestrial globe has become increasingly insignificant to just a speck in the universe. Our planet circles the sun, which is a star that is only one of billions of stars in our galaxy. And our galaxy is only one amongst billions of galaxies that make up the universe. And maybe there are even countless universes. We are, I'm afraid, on our planet a speck. We were once the center of that universe. Another revolutionary change came in our thinking with Charles Darwin. He argued as of course we all know, that living organisms have evolved and are related by descent. And he postulated a major mechanism for evolution, natural selection. This demonstrated that the life sciences also could be understood in terms of universal laws, just like the physical sciences. Up until then, the life sciences had been more descriptive. This was more explanatory. Darwin recognized the fact that his theory, his ideas could be couched in terms of a universal law, with the famous last sentence in The Origin of Species, which refers back to Newton. I quote, "Whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." It's a wonderful sentence. But notice his connection with Newton, of course, who was the pinnacle at that time and still is of science. But most importantly, and still contentious to some today, Darwin's ideas moved human beings from being specially created to being related to the rest of the living world. Just as Copernicus had moved the Earth from being the center of the universe, so Darwin moved humankind from a unique position separate from the rest of life. So advances in science and the mindset change of the Enlightenment, as Kant summarized, the emergence of man from his self-imposed infancy were brought about during the Industrial Revolution and those times. Actually, science is very much a creature of the Enlightenment. Incidentally, as indeed this great museum in which we are sitting tonight, which is a creature of the Enlightenment. The technological advances that have arisen from science and from the associated disciplines of medicine and engineering, for example, have been legion. The development of energy sources, steam, electric and internal combustion, nuclear and renewable sources of power, the use of new materials, iron, steel, ceramics, plastics, semiconductors, of machines of manufacture, leading to the robotized factory of today, of new means of transport, the rail locomotive, the steamship, the automobile, the aeroplane, the spaceship, of advances in communication and the management of information, with the telegraph, the radio, the television, the computer, and the World Wide Web. But unfortunately, of course, together with these advances for the good of humankind, there have been less desirable consequences. The construction of increasingly more effective and deadly weapons of war, and the overdevelopment of industrialization, leading to pollution and damage to our environment. Scientific approaches increased agricultural production, such that a crop today yields for each acre of land under cultivation many, many times more than in the Neolithic times. Improvements in human health and increases in the longevity of humankind have dramatically occurred in the last century or two. Only 100 years ago, even in highly developed countries such as the United Kingdom, life expectancy was around 50 years, probably only an increase of 15 years since the agricultural revolution 10,000 years previously. Yet in the last 100 years, largely due to changes based on science and what we learned from that and have applied to society, life expectancy has increased to around 80 years, an increase of 30 years. This is a dramatic change which we sometimes don't fully recognize. There's been other revolutionary consequences of science for society, centered on the questions of what does it mean to be human. Like all other living organisms, human beings are to be understood in terms of their inherited genes, their cellular chemistry, their interactions with the environment, and with the rest of society, with other human beings. And what do these things mean for our sense of what we are, for free will, for the use of punishment and justice, for equality? These are quite profound questions for society. Studies based on evolutionary genetics and animal behavior have implications for ethics and morality. Science has a habit of invading other domains of human activity, which at first sight do not appear to have a place for science. This was the case for Galileo and Darwin. It's still the case today. Modern scientific advances have increasing impacts on spheres of activities, once thought to be the domain solely of politics, of philosophy, or of religion. Modern science has another, more curious type of impact, which I believe is going to be also revolutionary, and that is on human knowledge in a more general sense. Let me explain. Einstein, in his theory of general relativity, proposed a continuum of space-time, accounting for gravity, which undermined the common-sense view of the world expressed in terms of time and the three dimensions of space. That's the common-sense way that we view the world. Einstein's approach has resulted in a theory that is no longer completely in accord with our common sense, that inherent to our framework of experience and understanding are time and three dimensions of space, no longer can be used to explain great physical understanding. Studies of atomic structure some years later led to quantum mechanics, a sort of Alice in Wonderland type of world, a place where Schrödinger's cats can be both alive and dead at the same time. But despite not being explicable or understandable in terms of common sense, the subsequently developed standard model has led to extraordinary precision in predictability of the behaviors of the ultimate constituents of matter. This is a revolutionary shift in our thinking about what human knowledge is, because what it means is that we are developing explanations that work beautifully, but are far beyond our common sense understanding. And there's something there that I'm not even sure most of us have quite got to terms with. I think even the high-energy physicists, and my daughter sitting here is one of them, fully understands what they're doing when they do their collisions of protons. Ensuring that excellent science continues to be carried out. Science leads to these revolutionary advances in our knowledge, and this scientific knowledge results in sustained revolutionary changes, as I've argued. So the question is, how can we ensure that revolutions in scientific knowledge and understanding continue, and how can we ensure that they result in improvements in the human condition? And I'd like to spend the last part of my talk considering those issues. Now, ensuring that excellent science continues to be carried out requires attention to how the research endeavour can be nurtured and can be sustained. Key to this is recognising that great scientific advances are usually driven by great scientists. We need to provide scientific education and training to allow such scientists to develop and even go to university. And some of us had some difficulties there, as you've heard. Then we need to identify and support them with an environment and adequate resources so they can prosper. Most importantly, they need to be given the freedom to pursue what they judge to be interesting, and they should be protected from counterproductive interference from often well-meaning but frequently misguided scientific managers and leaders. Notice I attack here our scientific leaders and not our politicians, which is the tendency. We need better scientific leadership most of the time. Also, I do not think that science ultimately flourishes in societies which are not free, a point which is not often made. Freedom of thought in science is essential, and fundamentally that requires a free society. And if we pay attention to keeping all of this in place, then in my view, science will continue to prosper. Perhaps less clear is how do we ensure that science will bring about improvements in the human condition. Critical for this is a good and healthy relationship between science and society. We need to make sure that science is used for the public good rather than the reverse. As I've already argued, science has always been employed for purposes that are not necessarily good for humanity, weapons of war that can even threaten our very existence, as in the case of nuclear weapons. Now, ultimately, making good decisions about the use of knowledge based on science depends on societies with the right values, with good values, underpinned, in my view, by healthy and effective democracies. For science to play its proper role requires a public at ease with science and a democracy that can cope with the complex decisions that involve science. It is all linked together. And to get this right has to start in our schools. We have to provide a science education that not only trains future scientists for the next generation, that's obviously a very minor part of the population in school, but also trains a future citizenship that can cope with the increasing effects that science will have on our democracy. Students need to be aware that science is a way of thinking, of experimenting and making observations, of weighing up evidence. They need to know that science can be tentative in its conclusions, as I've argued, but can also lead to advances in knowledge of the world and of ourselves that can be relied on. Science is not simply a series of facts and figures, although some of these can be extraordinary, stimulating and inspirational. Science is a process that builds reliable knowledge. Every student that leaves school should, for example, know the difference between astrology and astronomy. I doubt if more than 50% do at the present time. They also should know the differences between theories that underpin homeopathy compared with evidence-based medicine. A key requirement of a modern educational system must be to equip a future citizenship to cope with the impacts that science and technology will have on their lives and on the proper functioning of a healthy democracy. And this will be required more and more as science and technology impinges on our lives. It will increasingly become a central feature of an effective functioning democracy. The next challenge is how can we ensure that public policy is made based on the best scientific knowledge that is available, and also that the public is comfortable and supportive of such policies. Both government and parliamentary scrutiny procedures must be fully aware of how science can contribute to policy making by ensuring that they have access to the highest quality scientific advice and by heeding that advice. Scientific evidence and argument should be listened to, it should be treated with respect. And for this to be effective requires scientists to adhere to the highest standards of behaviour. They need to be open and honest, free from hype, to be absolutely clear about what knowledge is more certain, what is more tentative. And this can be difficult when politicians and the public demand certainties that cannot be delivered. The other part of this challenge, ensuring the public is comfortable with the consequences of advancement in scientific knowledge, requires highly effective engagement mechanisms between society and scientists to be in place. Engagement is a two-way process, and listening to public concerns and their understanding of the relevant science is critical. Different fora and processes can deliver effective engagement, such as citizen juries, public consultation, opinion polls, and other mechanisms of grassroots engagement. It is not adequate just to engage with lobby groups and single interest groups who may not always properly reflect the concerns of the public. Better engagement over complex scientific issues relevant to policy will bring about better policy and help that better policy to be effectively introduced. The other important issue is good communication about science in the mass media. Society as a whole needs to be well informed about advances in science, the consequence of science, and this is achieved through the mass media of television, radio, newsprint, and the internet, for example. There is a special need for the media, especially the media that reaches many millions, such as television, to be highly responsible in their reporting. They need to avoid sensationalism, to be careful about so-called balance when certain opinions have little evidential support or are potentially highly flawed, to avoid also mystification, to properly explain what can be very difficult topics. There are excellent communicators of science in the mass media, and they should be given every encouragement as they do a great service in keeping science high on society's agenda and therefore high on the agenda of politicians as well. I like to emphasize that because some of my academic colleagues are brilliant communicators, yet other of my academic colleagues criticize them for being on the television, criticize them because they're too good looking and erudite, and every little mistake they make on the television or the radio, they pick on, having no idea how stressful it is in front of a lens and going through it for the 10th time because a telephone rang or whatever, by which time you are just speaking complete gobbledygook. They have no idea how stressful it is. There are threats to what I've explained. We need to be aware of those individuals who mix up science based on evidence and rationality with politics, with ideology, where opinion, rhetoric and tradition hold more sway. We need to be aware of political or ideological lobbyists who do not respect science, cherry-pick data or argument with the intention of supporting predetermined positions. It's a complete antithesis of how science is done or talked about. We need to be aware of those who distort science to support particular fundamentalist religious beliefs, not based on the rigor of rational argument and data, but on faith and on revelation. We need to be aware of the relativists who argue that knowledge is culturally determined to such an extent that all views in principle are acceptable, even those not supported by reliable evidence or rational reasoning. Revolutions are unsettling, and they are often strenuously opposed. This was the case with Copernicus moving the Earth from the center of the universe. Remember, the Inquisition didn't argue with Galileo. They simply showed Galileo the instruments of torture. It also occurs when Darwin, who argued that man was specially created. These are fundamental and revolutionary changes, and they will be strenuously opposed, and they will continue to have effects, and new advances will have those effects. At its best, society has shown it can deal with these threats, and I am optimistic that in the future, society will increasingly see the value of science in bringing about these revolutionary changes to our knowledge and the revolutionary improvements in society and in the human condition. This is why I argue science is truly the most long-lasting revolutionary activity to humankind, and if it is nurtured and if the public are properly engaged, science will continue to bring great benefits to us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Brilliant, wonderful. And we've got, by the way, we're going to do questions, we'll do 20, 25 minutes. So I thought what I'd do is not hog the stage too much, because you and I could talk for hours on that, and it's so fascinating. And I'll just ask one question, then I'll hand it over. So prepare yourselves and have a think about what you want to ask Paul. That was rather inspiring, a compelling story around the revolutionary power of science. Now, as a media executive, however, I'm twitching a little bit for...
I hope so.
A story.
I hope so, yeah.
A story.
Ah.
Yeah?
Yep.
Not so much a news story, but one of the things that was fascinating there, as you were talking about the climatic conditions in which, you know, science can thrive, you said something very compelling, which was it's where it encroaches on areas of already established belief or opinion. Mm. If I, as a kind of my journalistic instincts, would say, okay, we've got a few in the room actually, where are the areas of territory now that you think, because you need events in the revolution, not just the overarching story. Where do you think would be areas, because the tech guys have their go and look at driverless cars, go and look at VR, go and look at whatever it would be. In science, if you said to me, what area in society, give me a couple of areas that you think this encroachment, it's such a compelling hypothesis. Where are we going to encroach? Where are we going to fear this discomfort?
So I touched on a couple.
Yeah.
Ethics and morality, which we would traditionally have always thought was the realm of a moral philosopher, perhaps a religion.
Yeah.
These are now being encroached upon, not dealt with, I don't want to say explained completely, they're absolutely not, but they're being encroached upon by our understanding of how altruism arose in genetics and evolutionary psychology, and in thinking about, if we take altruism, why we might want to be nice to our relatives, why we might want to be nice...
Radical stuff here going on.
Radical stuff.
Yeah.
Why we might want to be nice to members of our community. And you can begin to see and make explanations for why that might arise, that altruism, due to standard understanding of genetics and behaviour.
And we'll be able to play with the altruism. I mean, are you going to be the grand engineer of some of this?
I wouldn't argue that at this moment. What I would argue only is that it helps us think about how altruism might behave and how some sort of ethical behaviour might work. But you said, can we play with it? That's another area. Neuroscience, which at the moment is still pretty crude, frankly, but neuroscience is giving us the ways of understanding how brains work, which with it will bring ways we can actually manipulate brains. And this has significant consequences. We will better understand giving evidence in a court if we understand more about memory and recall of memory, which, as we know, is extremely difficult. And so understanding evidence in court is something that could be influenced by this. If we can modify behaviours, and we know we can do that, just drinking alcohol, for example, but in more extraordinary ways with drugs, what does this also mean for what we are? And indeed, a third point, which is related to that, we are a consequence of our genes, of our environment, of how we've developed. Now, there may be aspects of our behaviour and so on which are really quite strongly genetically determined. Usually it's a mixture. And then if that leads to, say, criminal behaviour, we have to ask ourselves, can somebody really be guilty if they're criminal of something which they were born with? I mean, we have to think about these things. So I'm only giving examples of things that
there's at least 3 TV series in there, at least. I'm excited. Right, I'll hand it over to the audience. Please name and, where you're coming from would be very useful, just so we set that. So if you get the hands beginning to show, we'll start at the front and then move on from there, and I'll call people out. Make sure you've got a mic, please.
Hayden Jones, Fujitsu. So first of all, thank you for such a challenging and beautifully presented piece of thinking, truly original for a Wednesday evening, absolutely brilliant. So even revolutionary almost. So I suppose the question that I'd like to pose is, who will be these new revolutionaries? Will there be scientists? Will there be politicians? Will there be physicists? Will there be biologists?
Well, I think that, first of all, I'm not imagining revolutions occur every other week. And you'll notice I went back to 2 great revolutions, one over 3 centuries ago, 1.5 centuries ago, because I think they're great examples. So revolutions do not occur every week, major ones, though minor ones do all the time. For revolutions to occur and be effective, it requires different sorts of people. I mean, the actual understanding will come from, I think, initially scientists, so that's going to be critical. Actually turning that into something useful is not often so good for scientists. I'm hopeless at it, for example, but we have engineers, we have medical doctors, for example, who are much better at doing that. So we need those with a more applied perspective. But then we need political leadership, and that's crucial. We need political leadership which will understand. No, they don't have to understand all the details of science, but they have to understand what it can bring, and that they have a responsibility to bring what can be advanced in that understanding to the improvement in society. So political leadership is a crucial one as well.
How would you mark them at the moment, Paul? The political leaders, give them just a quick mark. What would you?
Do you know, we all love to criticise politicians, I have to say, but in Britain over this, we are amongst the best in the world. We are certainly at B+.
Good.
At least.
At least B. No, it's...
At least
I'm not
some of them. Some of them.
Some of them. Variable average B+. I
And
hope.
by the way, I might as well say this. If we want good science in the country, we have to stay in the EU. Okay?
I suspect that's a couple of questions gone. So yeah, this lady here. Yeah, thank you.
Madeline Starr from Carers UK. I want to go back to what you said about altruism.
Altruism, yeah.
Altruism and the link between family and community. So we are supporting families who are engaged in the activity of caring, fundamental to the human condition. I think how we manage care and caring in society, one of the greatest challenges will be as great a challenge as how we manage climate change, because the demographics tell us that that's the way it's going to be.
Yes.
We desperately want to bring everything that science and technology can bring to the human condition to help to normalise care and caring in society, but also bring into it ways in which we can creatively and technologically support this fundamental activity without it knocking people over. So I think that link between the human condition and science and technology, for us, that's where the revolution lies.
Well, altruism is key for personal relationships, for the development of society, for the maintenance of communities. And as we have now clearly understood in recent decades, it's a responsibility that has now got to cross into future generations, as you rightly pointed out, because we now begin to understand that things we do now will have significant impact 1, 2, 3 generations away. And climate change, you mentioned, is a key one in this area. So we have to re-look at how we think about altruism and morality and ethics by now thinking about what we do, what will that mean for our children, our children's children, and their children. And that does require a great focus on altruism. Because if it means that we have to reduce economic growth for a while and to a certain level, that affects us today, but we are investing in the future of humanity. And that requires also a different way of thinking about ethics, which has its origins in the sense of identifying the problem in science. It's another, as I completely agree with you, revolutionary change in how we should think about humanity and the problems that face humanity.
Why don't we take one? There's a gentleman, I think he's got the mic up there. I'll keep going around as fast as we can, so go. No.
Thank you. David Crawford.
Could you wave? I'm not trying to...
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
David Crawford, Universities of Essex and Ravensbourne in London. Thank you for your talk tonight. It's been really good, and I can now proudly go home and tell my children I know the inventor of the frozen chicken nugget was Bacon, so that's a useful thing for me to know. My question is sort of leading on from there. Nowadays, we wouldn't go out and get the chicken and stuff it full of ice. We would do it all by simulation. We'd build a model of the chicken. We'd run various simulations on it, and we would get our answers and answer our challenges purely through simulation and computer work, probably. Do you think this type of methodology that we use nowadays, using much more simulation and, if you like, virtual reality, takes away some of our creativity and challenges, and that in the end we're actually blunting?
So too much simulation, not enough real action.
I think that in the scientific sphere, and I think you were touching not only upon that sort of investigation, but perhaps also recreation as well. In the scientific sphere, we need to use every tool we have available to understand the world, which is complicated enough. That will include observation, experiment, ideas, hypotheses, and part of developing that and testing that will include simulation of the sorts that you're describing. If you're asking a slightly different question, which is, do we distance ourselves from reality by using too much beautiful TV programs about nature and so on, and by use of the computer? It distances us from reality. I think there is something in that. Yeah. I'm an amateur astronomer, and I have a telescope, And I look at Jupiter, say, you can see Jupiter if you look in the west this evening, except it will be raining, of course. But if you look at it, and you squint, you glimpse, you can see the Medici moons. We now call them something different, of course. You can just about see a little sort of fudge on the, little on the disk. But it is real. Now you compare it with what Hubble produces. Of course, it's nothing. But somehow we've put it in the way of reality. And if we just need, there is something about seeing it directly connected.
Fantastic.
And I think that's really important.
You can guess what Paul's special luxury item was on the desert island.
It was.
It was a telescope. I'll go to the front again, and then we'll keep working our way through.
Hello, Sir Paul. I'm John Hardy from ITN. I'm very interested in the subject of where science knocks up against law and ethics, and how far science can take us in answering certain questions. So I'll give you a personal example. My wife last year was tested positive for the BRCA1 gene, made so popular by Angelina Jolie last week. She's fine, by the way, it's great. But when speaking to the eminent professor, he gave her what he thought was good news. And he said, good news is you have 2 sons, and by the time they come to have children, we'll be able to pre-test the eggs in their wives so to deselect those which carry the BRCA1 gene. To which he said, well, great news, you're just breeding people like me out of existence. So where are the limits in your mind of where science can make those kind of decisions? And given science's limits, how do you make those kind of ethical decisions?
Well, I think he was a bit cavalier, if you want my view. First of all, of course, we cannot do that particular thing yet. It is possible that we might, and there have been recent advances. Some of you might want to read about CRISPR-Cas, which allow us to be very precise with this. But these are really critical issues that have to be fully discussed in society, because not everybody is comfortable with some of these changes, and we need to debate them. Now, how do we deal with this properly? Once again, in the UK, we do it reasonably well. There was very sensible debate. I worked for 8 years in the United States when I was president of Rockefeller University, and it is simply nowhere near as good in the
What are we doing well?
discussed.
Because I'm not sure the audience would know how we have that debate in the UK.
Well, we had that debate. We have the Human Embryo Authority who actually led upon it. It's a very decent, rational, independent body. It comes to conclusions and recommendations. Politicians look at those recommendations. It's a very reasoned, rational
with the speed of change that because the tech is very interesting with Demis here. We pushed him a little bit in the same area in AI.
Yeah, and what did
you
he...
could click, well, they're forming their ethical committee, they're doing this, that, and the other, but you could feel bluntly the market, their market moving so fast.
So Demis, you see, that area advances incredibly rapidly, and biology tends to go slower, so we do have a bit more time. On the other hand, biology touches upon all sorts of things like what it is to be human, what it is to be dead, what it is to be alive, and these are very complex
It's a fairly significant agenda, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a very, yes, you can see Monty Python having a field day with it. But the real key is proper engagement with the public early on so we can discuss these things before we can do them.
Okay, we've got 10 minutes, so shorter questions. And,
and I'm on long answers, I do apologise.
Hi, this is Francesca from Ravensbourne. If you could make a quick comment on the relationship that science and art have actually developed over the last decades.
Quick question,
Quick question, science and art.
It is quick.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do my best. Outside my institute, there is a wonderful sculpture actually called Paradigm. So we just one of the biggest sculptures in London. Where I don't think science and art intersect well is where people often say, "Oh, isn't this fossil beautiful?" Okay, and they say that's art, And I'm not in that category. Where I think there is a similarity is in 2 sort of areas. The first is this: the act of creativity, of the leaps of imagination and intuition to understand something, and the act of creativity in developing and viewing something differently. That's one thing. The second, where science and art, good science and good art, and is a sense of completeness in understanding, a sort of wholeness of something that can come out of great art and can come out of great science. That's where I think they're similar.
Wow. There's a short answer, that wasn't half bad, I'll tell you. It's so good. Shall we just, this gentleman here, we'll just go here, I'll keep going around. Then we've got up the back after that. I'll just keep teeing up as much as I can, thanks.
Hi, Jeremy Webb, New Scientist. Paul, I wonder if you think that science is a finished pastime. Is it perfect, or will it actually be taken over? You keep mentioning Demis Hassibis, you know, and we know that artificial intelligence is now analysing vast data sets and coming up with patterns and regularities that human beings would never see. They are writing theories that no human could ever write.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we need the sorts of artificial intelligence algorithms that Demis is producing to look for patterns amongst all this data, and I think it's very good at that. He is thinking about how, as are other artificial intelligence, people interested in artificial intelligence, in how they can build on those patterns and regularities to ideas. But I would say at this moment, it is no competition now. What it will be 50 years from now, 30 years from now, perhaps, I'm not sure. But now, we need them, but they are no substitute.
Has someone got a mic up there? Sorry, I can't see.
Duncan Botting,
Great.
IET Energy.
Can you wait? Sorry, I can't. Great. Hello.
Yeah, great.
Duncan Botting, IET Energy Sector Chair. Following on from the question around art and science,
Yeah.
the intersection between engineering and science, and the ethics around bioengineering, and your thrust is the ethics issue of where we intervene.
Well,
what are your thoughts?
yeah, my thoughts are that much of what I've been saying are issues we need to consider actually are science upon which has been built engineering and medical advances. So often the impact in thinking about the effects on society emerge from all of that. Sometimes it is with the science itself, like Copernicus, but most often it's understanding something and then knowing that you can intervene with early life, keeping a fetus alive, for example, which is where the ethical problems come. So that I see them all as part of the same thing.
Great. Question there, and then we'll go to this lady here.
John Walmsley, I'm a publisher.
Can
Down
you wait?
here.
Sorry,
Yeah, sorry,
it's
down there.
Is the
But I thought you were over
representation...
there,
I was
you know?
getting the next one ready.
Is the representation of science in our government optimal at the moment? And if not, how could it be more optimal?
Actually, I've written a report on this for the government, which was published last November.
Right.
Often, scientists like me say we need more scientists in government. I actually don't think that's true. I think we need to have politicians in government who understand how science works and knows how to get advice from science. And I think that's really the critical point. We have some champions for science in government at the moment, and we are heavily reliant upon them. Osborne, as Gordon Brown was before him, were champions of science. And I have to go to them every time if I'm trying to develop something, because mostly I'm listened to politely, but I can't get immediate access. So we are reliant on a few people. I'm trying to embed science throughout government, and if you read the white paper that's coming out next week, you will see how we might try and do that, because there are some ideas there.
Good. I'm glad your white paper's coming out after.
Not my white paper, government's white paper.
We'll go over there.
Just influenced by me, that's all.
Yep.
Hi, Rachel Walters, University of Sheffield. I'm really interested to hear what you said about science and society and the kind of relationship between good science and society. And you mentioned the press maybe not presenting science in the best way, not presenting it in the most reliable way. How do you think this could be bettered? How do you think, is this something that needs to be regulated or changed? Or
So we've got the issue. I think it's the levers. What are you going to fix it?
Yeah. First of all, I don't think that the press does a bad job, honestly. I said there are risks with it. I often think that science journalists do an excellent job only to have it ruined by a terrible headline or a particular spin, and that is very, very unfortunate. I tell you the way I would go about it is not by regulation. It's not by referring to the great learned societies like the Royal Society. The Science Media Centre, which was pioneered in this country, has put together a panel of expert scientists who happen to be media friendly and don't just look at their shoes all the time when they talk to you. And when a topic comes up in the newspapers or so on, if you contact the Science Media Centre, they can say, well, you can talk to A, B, C, D and E, and you can get a view on it. I think that's a great device. And then what they'll do is they'll get quotes and it will go out onto the internet. And that's the way I would do it. Not through regulation, but by simply improving contacts with those who actually have something sensible and knowledgeable to say.
Very clear. Right, we'll take a question there and a question there, and then we'll be done. Sorry to those people who didn't make it. I'm sure Paul will be around for a few minutes afterwards if you want to.
Daniel Benjamin, University of Westminster and IET member. So, touching upon your education and training you were mentioning about, would you be an advocate, ambassador programs that nurtures the next generation going through education to promote industry and future engineers? So, how do we kickstart promoting these programs and deliver these programs by communicating at a local level, such as one school or many schools?
So ambassadors in schools, the school intervention, you spoke passionately about that.
Yep.
What's going to...
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, let us not underestimate the great power of the mass media for really a big impact. Look what happened with Attenborough and interest in natural history and zoology 30 years ago. Look what's happening with Brian Cox today with physics. This is a big impact. I know it's not what you said, but that is important for education. In schools, we have to have inspirational teachers. And it is difficult to be an inspiring teacher in a difficult subject like science. We have to help nurture and train them to be inspirational. And that isn't learning the periodic table. It isn't learning the periodic table. It is understanding what the basis of the periodic table is about. We should reform the curriculum so we excite, inspire, and explain what science is. I'm not knocking the periodic table.
Listening to that, it's inspiring to it. Why can't that happen?
I think that
I just want it to happen. What's going on?
Well, I think that it is I think it's difficult teaching science. I mean, I think there's no point in us pretending it isn't. You know, it is difficult. And so I think it's got to be root and branch looked at as to how we focus on explanation, how we can get inspiration, because kids get turned off with this stuff because it's hard. And I get a little irritated when people sort of get all happy clappy about this and sort of say, well, it isn't hard. It is quite hard. I mean, there are things we can do. You look, when I was a kid, I read in a natural history book, why don't you do a project on where your spiders' webs are in the garden? So I went round dutifully, because I was a dutiful child, and mapped all the spiders' webs in the garden and then thought where they were and why they were there and all this sort of stuff. I mean, that sort of thing is great, and we need that with everything else.
Last question.
My name is Grace. I'm a North London medical doctor. With those in sort of decision-making roles in society being, as you say, at liberty to sometimes cherry-pick evidence, how do we counteract that in an environment where we're holding ourselves to a higher standard?
So you've touched a little bit, the cherry-picking of evidence in the media, or in general storytelling. How do you counteract that? You talked about the media centre. What's the other ways you found effective? And certainly as a media executive, it's always been something we struggle with, how you get that balance and equal weighting of arguments, all of that. What's the interventions?
Well, first thing I have to say, telling stories about science is a good device. I mean, we dehumanise science by taking the stories out, and I'm a big fan of the stories of how science is done, and we should do that. The balance issue is one which, as I said, the Science Media Centre can help with, because there is really this understandable wish for the media to be balanced, So they will hunt around. I mean, we see it in the EU debate. There's only 2 people that I've seen who are in favour of EU departure for science, and they're up all the time, as if, there's thousands of them. The polls are 90%, 88% of all scientists are in favour of staying in. I mean, it is a no competition. But the media always feels it has to be fair. I actually have some sympathy with it. This idea of balance and accuracy, what I think is this is, we have to be, scientists like me, on the front foot in correcting those errors. Initially, politely, initially, courteously. I get more irritated.
Go to the next phase.
I go more irritated with serial offenders. And when they serially offend, as I once said before, we should crush and bury them and their ideas, at least their ideas.
Wonderful. On that uplifting finish, I'm now going to hand to Naomi Clymer, who is president of the IET, to close us off. But Paul, thank you very much. That was truly wonderful. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you. So a huge thank you to Sir Paul Nurse, Nobel Prize winning geneticist and cell biologist, Desert Island Discs guest, and fabulous speaker for your absolutely brilliant lecture on science as revolution. Thank you very much. Just chatting to Sir Paul beforehand, I jokingly said, well, how wrong can it go? And he said, well, I might fail to convince the audience that it's a revolution. So just for the record, I'm convinced, Sir Paul. You've got me thinking about the impact of science and how deep that goes across society. And you made really compelling arguments for a democracy that can cope with complex decisions that involve science. And somewhat predictably, I would argue that we need that for complex decisions that involve engineering as well. So thank you very much for a thought-provoking talk on the revolution that's going to change our future and should move humanity forward. The IET is really delighted to be able to co-host tonight's lecture with the Royal Television Society and to have had a speaker of such incredible calibre. The IET's mission is to inspire, inform and influence, and I can safely say that this evening's lecture has inspired, informed and influenced me. The IET aims to further knowledge for the benefit of society, and this type of event is exactly the type of thing that we believe will help us to do exactly that. I would also like to thank our chair this evening, Tim Davey, Chief Executive of BBC Worldwide. You did a fantastic job of steering us through the evening, so thank you very much for that. So I hope you all have been inspired, informed and influenced by tonight's lecture. It's been my absolute pleasure to be part of it. Thank you once again, Sir Paul. Thank you for your great questions. Thank you very much for coming. Good night.